Behind this row of unassuming storefronts on Minneapolis's East 24th Street lies a little slice of Somalia. Dozens of shops sell scarves and books, fried snacks, and sweet Somali tea. Pretty much everything you can buy in Mogadishu, but in the heart of Minnesota. Marian Abdi moved here from Somalia 17 years ago and runs one of those shops. I sell rugs and flowers, she says. And it's not just to support her family in the U.S.
Who is it that you send money to at home? Who is still in Somalia in your family?
My brothers, uncles, and aunts, she says. Each month, she sends anywhere from $300 to $500 to family and friends back home.
So this shop basically helps support not just your family, but your family, their neighbors, their friends, all from here, basically.
Yes, she says, the whole family. I have this business, and I have to help them. Marian Abdi is one of 85,000 Somali Americans in the U.S., roughly a third of whom live in Minnesota. The majority fled East Africa after Somalia's civil war in the 1990s. According to community leaders in Minneapolis-St. Paul, 80% of the Somali Americans here send money back to East Africa. Aid groups say 40% of Somalia's population relies on those dollars, known as remittances, to survive. Mohammed Idris runs Araha, the American relief agency for the Horn of Africa, based in Minneapolis.
It is estimated about $1.3 billion are the amount of money that come in an annual basis to Somalia from Somalis in diaspora. The remittance is the lifeline, is the backbone for Somalia.
But now, the $215 million that flow from the Somali diaspora in the U.S. each year may be in jeopardy. The U.S. government is increasingly concerned some of those remittances are going to terror groups that have taken hold in Muslim-majority Somalia, particularly Al-Shabaab, an al-Qaeda-linked organization behind an assault on a Kenyan university this April that killed more than 140 people, and an attack on a Kenyan mall 2 years ago that killed 67. Adam Subin is the U.S. Treasury Department's acting undersecretary for terrorism and financial intelligence.
Anytime you're talking about funds transfer mechanism, whether it's wires, whether it's the banking system, any funds transfer can be exploited by bad actors, including terrorist groups. And obviously, when you're talking about Somalia, Al-Shabaab has a presence there, and it's had a very harmful influence on the people of Somalia.
As a result, Treasury has imposed stricter controls on money transfers to Somalia, where there's a weak central bank and limited financial oversight.
Any conduit, anytime you're talking about funds transfer mechanism, whether it's wires, whether it's the banking system, any funds transfer can be exploited by bad actors, including terrorist groups. And obviously, when you're talking about Somalia, Al-Shabaab has a presence there.
But according to Ryan Allen, an associate professor at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, Treasury's strict anti-money laundering rules are having the inadvertent effect of pressuring banks that normally help facilitate remittances to Somalia.
Because of the expectation on the due diligence, the banks run a risk if the money should fall into the wrong hands. Despite their best efforts even, they can face some really significant penalties, in the millions of dollars kinds of penalties.
With that in mind, these intermediary banks that hold the accounts for these money transfer organizations started closing some of these accounts?
That's right. Slowly, one by one, and then a kind of a rash of closings. Many of the banks are deciding that the risk is not worth the return.
Money transfers to Somalia are complex. Senders, say in Minneapolis, bring cash to a money transfer window. The money is then held in an intermediary bank, wired through a clearinghouse in the Middle East, and finally winds up in East Africa. But if the money ends up in the wrong hands, the intermediary banks may be held responsible. This February, one of those institutions, Merchants Bank of California, responsible for up to 80% of U.S. to Somalia remittances, decided to get out of the business.
Right now, for regular Somalis in the Twin Cities, the number of Somali remittance that doing this business are shrinking.
Mohammed Idris, whose group has offices throughout East Africa, is still able to send money to his colleagues in Somalia. But the remittance firms in Minneapolis are capping amounts he can send abroad and charging higher fees.
Remember, there is no traditional bank in Somalia. And that's, even the UN use these wire transfer because it's the only mean to send money to Somalia. Businesses, charities, government.
But some of those dollars have made their way from the U.S. to militant groups in Somalia. In 2011, 2 Somali American women from Rochester, Minnesota, were convicted of sending $8,600 to al-Shabaab. That same year, a Somali cab driver in St. Louis pleaded guilty to providing $6,000 to help al-Shabaab buy a vehicle. And in 2013, a jury in San Diego found 4 Somali men guilty of conspiring to raise funds for the terror group.
So far, the U.S. government has only been able to find some isolated cases of this, right? And so how much more widespread it might be is really hard to determine.
Acting Treasury Undersecretary Adam Subin won't say exactly how much money he believes has made its way from the U.S. to al-Shabaab. But his concern lies with the lack of any formal banking infrastructure on the Somali side of remittance transactions.
And so what we're talking about is a very opaque, if you will, a black hole where those funds are going. That's the root concern of banks who are asking hard questions about how do we know the funds are going where they're supposed to be going.
Money transfer offices in the U.S. can check the names of money senders and recipients against a government list of known terrorist supporters, but their counterparts in East Africa have no such ability. Abdul Aziz Sagule runs a trade group for money transfer offices in Minnesota.
How do you know that some of this money might not eventually get into the wrong hands?
They know their customers. They know people who send money. If they see something is happening, there's a way you can report to the government.
Sagule says lack of transparency is an issue, but the risk is negligible.
If you look at the average person sending, if you look, that's going to be less than $200. And that money is going to the needy people in refugee camps, people destitute.
And Somali Americans, like 24-year-old truck driver Abdi Salad, say they're as concerned as the U.S. government about militant groups back home. After all, their families are in danger.
But we are not terrorists. We are not supporting terrorists.
Yeah.
We just want to send them money in our family.
Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges has teamed up with her state's congressional delegation to press for a national solution, one that balances security concerns with her constituents' desires to aid their families.
It's a question of banks, federal regulators, the State Department, Treasury working together to find solutions that will both keep our country secure and keep the world secure, as we should and as we must, but that will also allow folks to send dollars back home. And frankly, not being able to send dollars back home in some ways is a larger security issue. It gives a reason for people to say, at one point you had access to resources from home, now you don't, the West doesn't care about you, which, we don't need to add to that pile of messages.
Somalia may be...
In Washington, Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison has taken up his constituents' concerns as well. He's proposed reducing the liability for banks that facilitate remittances. So if money goes to the wrong people, the banks would face less severe punishment from regulators.
Couldn't that help at least loosen up the gears a little bit?
I don't think that's the answer, in that it's not a question of regulatory liability. Banks don't want to be handling money flows if they don't know where they're going, especially into a high-risk area like Somalia. And we can't be in the practice of saying you don't have to worry about your anti-money laundering or counter-terrorist financing regulatory obligations.
The Treasury Department and other U.S. agencies are working to strengthen banking oversight in Somalia. University of Minnesota professor Ryan Allen says that could reduce the risk of money ending up in terrorist hands and help keep the remittance pathway open.
If we have a well-established and strong central bank in Somalia, if we have a banking sector that is capable of doing assurances on who's getting money and keeping tabs on where the money is going, that's the best long-term solution to this problem.
But it's the short term that has Somali Americans in Minneapolis most concerned. Mohammed Idris, who runs the relief agency Raha, says slowing the remittance flow could sabotage Somalia's gradual steps toward greater political stability.
It means that our work will be doubled. It will means that the fragile situation that is getting better right now in Somalia is going to reverse.